Good morning and a very warm welcome to Breakfast with Arab. Fantastic, a really good house full. I hope you all had a good Easter break. My name is Farah and I am the Marketing and Communications Leader for Building London. And so to our wonderful speaker this morning. Pavlina was born in Cyprus and played competitive tennis from the age of 11. She was not sure what to study and certainly not sure which career path to take. Her father suggested that she study electrical engineering, and Pavlina thought, why not? I'm good in maths, and decided to study in the States as she wanted to continue playing tennis. Tennis was her passion, and she played competitively from the age of 11. Pavlina studied at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. She graduated and decided to study for a master's. However, once again, she wasn't quite sure what to study, and once again, her father recommended that she study lighting. Being a diligent child, she listened to him, and this is how she ended up in London. Pavlina finished her master's dissertation 1 month early, and through a contact, she found out about Arab. She duly applied as an electrical engineer. However, thankfully for all of us, she was interviewed by the wonderful Florence Lamb and Jeff Shaw from the lighting group, and this is how Pavlina started her career with us here at Arab. Over the last 8 years, Pavlina has worked on a tremendous range of projects, and these include the Humex Museum in Mexico City with David Chipperfield Architects, the London Aquatic Centre with the late Zaha Hadid, whom we sadly lost just a few weeks ago. Pavlina has also worked on the designs of the Broad Museum in Los Angeles, designed with Diller, Scofido, and Renfro, which recently featured on the front page of FX magazine. Pavlina designed the Investcorp building with Zaha Hadid Architects at St. Anthony's College for the University of Oxford. And again, last year won a Lux Award for Education and Healthcare Project in 2015. Currently, Pavlina is working on the extension of the Royal Academy of Arts with David Chipperfield Architects and Abu Dhabi Airport with KPF. So, without further ado, I'm really very happy to introduce the utterly charming and delightful Pavlina Akritas. Thank you, everyone.
Well, thank you all for being here this morning, and thank you, Farah, for guiding me with preparing the talk. Like Corbusier once said, the history of architecture is the history of the struggle for light, a quote that remains true today. Architecture design has historically aimed at maximizing available light during the limited hours of daytime. From the first human settlements and shelters, the need and experience of daylight has been defining our structures. The crude openings of these structures were often flexible in function and aimed to balance protection with functional daylight. And while daylight was always included for functional reasons, it was also sought for because of its powerful influence on human emotions and its ability to affect the character and experience of the space. For instance, the form and shape of the Roman Pantheon is exclusively defined by the way daylighting is intended to penetrate the interior and act as a huge sundial. And as early as in the medieval and Byzantine eras, church architects used daylight to effect a strong sense of spirituality. The dome at Hagia Sophia, an architectural miracle of its time, seems to be suspended from the sky, an impression made possible by the skillful positioning of numerous more clerestory windows at the base of the dome. Le Corbusier writes, light and illumination are inseparable components of form, space, and light. These are the things that create ambience and feel of a place, as well as the expression of a structure that houses the functions within it and around it. Light renders texture, illuminates surface, and provides sparkle and life. It is well known that mankind, and indeed womankind, have an innate desire for variety and change in their environment, whether it is the cars that they drive, the food that they eat, or even the clothes that they wear. And daylighting, whose intensity and color changes during the day and with the weathers and seasons, helps satisfy this desire. Daylighting remained the primary means of light to all types of building until the advent and widespread use of electricity in the early 20th century. Ever since, daylighting has been in retreat. The requirements for high levels of illumination, especially during the hours of darkness, the pressure to economize on floor-to-floor ceiling height, coupled with efficiency improvement in electric light sources, all had a substantial and negative impact on the use of daylighting in buildings. The turning point was reached in the 1960s when electric lighting substituted daylight as the primary means of light. As a result, fluorescent lighting became the norm, especially in workplaces. The dominance of artificial lighting rendered irrelevant other aspects of building design, such as the orientation and building envelope. It felt as if building design has lost part of its identity, and perhaps so had their occupants too. However, when the 1970s energy crisis struck in full force and the cost of power generation went through the roof, there was perhaps, unsurprisingly, a renewed interest in daylighting. Interestingly, it wasn't just its low cost that caught people's attention, but also some initial evidence on its positive effects on human well-being. Over the years, this evidence has grown in size and sophistication. We are now well aware that the positive effects of daylight range from improved performance in the workspace to increased sales and customer satisfaction in the retail sector, to higher academic achievement in the classroom. As Kahn put it, a room is not a room without natural light. For example, a study by University of Illinois researchers published in 2014 in the Journal of Clinical Sleep Medicine finds that office workers in windowless environments have lower productivity, a lack of vitality, and poorer overall sleep quality compared to workers exposed to windows and sufficient daylight. Regarding the retail space, research done by Hershkon-Mahoney Group and funded by the California Board of Energy Efficiency concluded that the presence of skylights was one of the 3 most important factors in increasing sales volume. The other 2 factors being the hours of operation per week and years since the last retrofit. Hershkon-Mahoney Group's research in schools found a high correlation between improved test scores, upwards by 10%, with increased daylight in classrooms. Finally, a research study funded by the Building Research Establishment provided compelling evidence that access to daylight reduced the average length of hospital stay by helping patients recover quicker after being operated, helping them overcome depression, and even easing their pain. Daylighting has thus once again become a major focal point in the built environment. It is then not surprising that well-lit buildings are in high demand. The Lighting Research Center in a study concludes that commercial real estate with no windows leads for about 20% less than commercial real estate with windows. But if the returns on daylight are so high, why is it that it is not much more prevalent? The fact of the matter is that despite its benefits, daylight also comes at a cost, and with the ever higher degree of urbanization, it may even become a luxury. High demand for space within cities has led to lower ceiling heights. Higher concentrations of people within existing built space means that proportionally less of these people occupy the well-lit areas of that space. And higher concentrations of buildings within existing city limits means that buildings are increasingly less exposed to daylight. All of the above have collectively reduced effective daylight illumination. A recent article in the London Evening Standard highlights this issue. We have a desperate fight for light in central London. There are 436 structures in the pipeline, which means that tens of thousands of people, both workers and residents, face loss of light. This is particularly important given that people in modern cities spend more than 90% of their time indoors. So we are faced with a dilemma. On the one hand, the benefits of daylight are indisputable and well understood. On the other hand, economic reality forces us to compromise and accept less than optimal lighting design solutions. How do we untie this Gordian knot? One idea has been to try and replicate daylight by artificial means. There have been many attempts to do this. The initial approach was to create luminous ceilings. There have also been attempts to create light sources with higher blue light content and higher color temperature. More recently, artificial windows have also been developed that reproduce natural sunlight, a clear blue sky, and sky's infinite depth. However, all these approaches are limited to how well they can replicate exterior lighting conditions. Daylighting is a much more dynamic phenomenon, and its light and intensity depends on a multitude of factors, such as the time of the day and the prevailing exterior conditions, neither of which are captured by the above techniques. To get daylight replication precisely right is important because in stagnantly lit environments, people can become disassociated with the natural outdoor cycle and variations in illumination levels, thus negating all the sought-for benefits of daylight. A quote by Kahn illustrates my point. We are born of light. The seasons are felt through light. We only know the world as it evoked by light. So why are we designing stagnant buildings? For several reasons. Our buildings are primarily stagnant because this makes the design simple and thus cheaper to build and maintain. In contrast, any sort of dynamic system will be sophisticated by design, will likely be difficult to install, and will also require a relatively complex control mechanism. On top of that, dynamic systems tend to be inefficient. For every unit of lighting power delivered, multiple units of installed power are necessary, which means it will be very difficult to comply with any restrictions on maximum installed capacity. Let's also not forget about code compliance. We are all aware of technical standards, and lighting standards in particular give requirements on average illumination and uniformity that needs to be followed. Dynamic systems will add another complexity to these standards. How can we show co-compliance? There are behavioral reasons as well. For example, the brute force of doing what one has always been used to is also at play here. When gas lighting at first and electric lighting later on were introduced, artificially lit environments had to be static because the technology to make them dynamic simply did not exist at the time. Yet when dynamic systems did become possible, we already got adapted to the static environments, and for a long time did not contemplate or simply resisted contemplating dynamic ones. Finally, some people just like to be able to manually control the light intensity of their environment, rather than let a piece of software do it for them. So how best can we, as architects, engineers, and designers, create a sense of place for employers and employees, for teachers and students, for doctors and patients, for retailers and customers, and in general, for the people of today and of the future? I think we should start creating spaces that arouse our senses. For this, one option could be to make buildings respond to the natural elements, for example, the rain, the sun, and the clouds. In other words, we could create buildings that project to the interior the exterior prevailing conditions. This has rarely been the case so far. Take electric lighting, for example. As mentioned to you earlier, it has traditionally worked independently of the exterior conditions, or at best only be slightly dependent on the exterior conditions through daylight linking. What this has resulted in is in spaces that look and feel the same, regardless of the changes that occur during the day, changes in the weather, and seasonal variations. What can we do? We now have the know-how to create indoor environments that are conscious of changes in time and changes in the exterior conditions. And if the exterior conditions get too repetitive, we do have the options to change the indoor environment and make it more pleasant than the present exterior conditions. How do we make this happen? Let's think about how we experience daylight in buildings. Daylight is typically introduced through windows, through skylights, and through atriums. Windows and views are important, but they're not always available or pleasant. In deep floor plates, skylights can offer a higher degree of flexibility in terms of uniformly illuminating the space below. Sunlight can offer a degree of delight, as it can create a vast range of unforgettable experiences. It can also introduce glare, increase solar heat gains, and it can significantly damage sensitive artifacts. In a work environment, sunlight penetration is controlled by the use of blinds, translucent glass, or some other sunscreening device. What this means is that we generally experience daylight in its diffuse format, where the directionality of sunlight has been minimized. Bearing this in mind, I would like to share some thoughts with you on a general approach of how we could introduce the daylight experience in daylight-deprived locations. The modern workspace environment generally requires a much lower illumination than in the past, when the existing lighting standards came into effect. This is largely because of computer being nowadays widely used. So the first thing we need to do is introduce a variable intensity artificial lighting that is sensitive to the building outdoors. The intensity of light may vary in a range that is both below and above the targets in the standards, and will depend on the exterior prevailing conditions. Next, we need to ensure that this dynamic lighting is used in spaces that have partial or no access to daylight, and that this is uniformly distributed across the floor, in effect creating an artificially diffuse daylit space. Finally, additional adjustable lighting ought to be used only as a supplement and on a localized ad hoc basis to meet any specific lighting needs. Please allow me to paint some pictures for you in order to make these principles a bit more visual. Imagine going to work and having to spend 8 hours in a uniform carpet of warm color lighting, regardless whether outside the building it is sunny, cloudy, or partly overcast. Sounds familiar? Now let me paint a second picture for you using the principles mentioned to you earlier. Imagine going to work and the light inside the building changing with the outdoors. Is it sunny outside? Let it be sunny inside. Is it cloudy outside? Let it be cloudy inside. Imagine the visual interest and excitement this could potentially create in a space typically perceived as monotonous and boring. Before concluding, let me take a step back and try and argue why I think such changes are important and necessary to our industry. As designers, we have grown accustomed to focusing on the functional performance of buildings, meeting code requirements, numbers, freezing out time, creating static, sterilized environments. We tend to forget that people like us will occupy the buildings we design. In the past, technological constraints provided a good excuse why we were not being more creative with illuminating our buildings. Yet, technological advances have revolutionized the nature of our work and the tools that we use, so that now we have less of an excuse for resisting more innovative lighting solutions. Now it's a good opportunity to change our approach and start identifying the value created by thoughtful, responsive, and innovative design. The point is not to innovate for the sake of innovation, but to innovate so as to improve human well-being. This is the fundamental principle of our profession. This is what Vitruvius had in mind when he articulated his 3 core elements of well-being: firmitas, utilitas, venustas. Firmitas, or firmness, health, refers to the absence of disease. Utilitas, or commodity, comfort, refers to the conditions of mind that expresses satisfaction with the environment, considering both qualitative and quantitative considerations. Venustas, or delight, happiness, refers to the emotions experienced. Keeping Vitruvius' triad in mind, I believe we need to shift our mindset and take a more human-centric approach to architecture. We need to have a more balanced design approach between hard and soft requirements, between standards and people. With every design, we need to start creating an innate sense of place, a place that is healthy, comfortable, and engaging, a place that ennobles people and makes them feel empowered and excited. For this reason, creating lighting that is only practical is not adequate anymore. Lighting needs to make a building a pleasure to live in, work in, and visit. I would like to read a quote by Jean Nouvel. The best engineer a few decades ago was someone who created the most beautiful beam or structure. Today, to do a structure, you cannot see or understand how it's done. It disappears, and you can talk only about color, symbols, and light. It's an aesthetic of miracle. Innovative design primarily improves well-being, but its impact goes beyond that. Fundamentally, it also reflects the values and standards of the building and its inhabitants. Is there value to being cheap? Good architecture has its price. Bad architecture, or no architecture, will cost more. The demand for high-quality buildings is rising all the time. Good buildings are a good business, whatever the economic climate. In this regard, lighting can have a considerable impact on how a business is perceived and how it performs. And similarly to what Frank Lloyd Wright believed, more and more so it seems to me, light is the beautifier of the building. It is undoubtable that natural light has many benefits. Natural light sets the mood in a room, whether it is the warmth of late spring or the somber tones of early winter. With the current rate of urbanization, the natural lighting experience is becoming a precious resource. It is now possible to take part of the preciousness of natural light and make it more readily available using electric lighting. So why don't we do that? And let's make more extraordinary spaces for people to live in. Thank you. I only take questions by email.
She doesn't mean that.
I do.
Hi, Russell Goldman, Design Engineering. I was wondering, how do you reconcile the transition from the bright daylit space next to the facade through to the centre of the building? You talked a bit about achieving uniformity, but I also think people would like to sit in different spaces as well. What's your thoughts on that?
I mean, my thoughts are primarily focused in locations that do not have access to daylight, because if you do have access to daylight, then it's difficult to match an artificially diffuse daylit space to the facade. So that's not really the condition that I was going for, if that makes sense. I mean, in terms of a window, it will naturally have this transition of light anyway, as you go deeper into the space.
So you'll have a transition zone between.
I mean, the thoughts that I had were primarily to do with a space that is not daylit, because I mean, there is no like daylight. So if it's possible to have daylight, then we should definitely aim for that.
If you had artificial windows, and that wall there is the best example I know, apart from ones that you showed, do you think there's a possibility of changing the whole approach to space planning, or is that a cynical approach? I mean, it would be a bit brutal, but imagine if you had a school which was, say, 60 metres across and divided into sections, but you had the appearance of daylight by having artificial windows like that. Do you think that would work?
I mean, if it's not possible to have daylight, then that's what I would recommend, is an alternate method to put a bit of more excitement into a space and make it a bit more interesting. So I would recommend, yes. If there is no daylight possible, then yes, I would recommend having an artificially dynamic system, because that's the next best thing we can do.
Well, I thought it was a very strong message that she was obviously trying to communicate through that. And it's interesting to see the examples that she showed. Some of the buildings are pretty amazing. I mean, we work in education and housing, so similar kind of problems that I guess that she's identified in getting daylight, natural light, etc. And I guess the main thing is to maybe try and go back to the schools and explain to them what the benefits are with the developers or the contractors or the clients, because there's no point in trying to fight them. I think you had to explain the benefits for their projects, whether it's an office, a school or residential, in cost terms as well, you know, the health, well-being, improved rental rates, etc. So I think that was probably one of the most strongest messages we could get across, because everyone understands. You can see the mood change in London when it becomes sunny. Everyone's happy on the tube. When it's raining, everyone's not very happy. So definitely it makes a difference. So yeah, no, it's very interesting actually. Very interesting.
I really enjoyed the talk. I'm very much interested in lighting and how we can use that in schools and residential projects. So it's actually really interesting to see how we can use sort of artificial lighting where you've got tight or dense urban areas and bring that in, whether with like classrooms in like inner city schools or in residential towers where we don't really have that much space. I work at David Miller Architects and we work with a lot of residential developers, and so I think this talk today, bringing in the things that we've talked about in terms of lighting and artificial lighting, would be great. I think we can influence the developer. We can expose them to a different way of thinking, a different way of lighting, and I think architects and designers can only work with developers to create a better urban environment.
In terms of taking on board that information that she spoke about this morning, I've got a project on site at the moment in Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia, because I work for HOK Education here in London though. And luckily for us, fortunately, we have a very informed client. So it's been very easy for us to interact with them and for them to understand what we're doing when we say we're increasing ceiling heights because of natural daylight. We're trying to get natural daylight further into rooms. Whereas I think the problem we're facing in the UK is that standards are being dumbed down too much, and there is a lot of focus on what developers do, but actually when it comes from the top and standards are not up to scratch, we'll all as an industry face problems, I think.
I found it really interesting, particularly the idea that natural daylight is so interesting, so useful rather. Never really thought of artificial windows before to try and use those in a project, and there's a few that could be really useful on. I like the idea how natural daylight changes so much, and that the idea that I've been using moon tubes before, but they don't have so much variety as natural daylight. The problem is how much a UV degrades, but hopefully you guys can find a way around that. Developers are driven a lot by cost, and so if they can see a cost advantage in having natural daylight And the best way to do that, I always find, is to offer them value. If people pay more for a better design, and this is why I can justify it as well, people want natural daylight, so that's really useful. So yeah, hopefully the talk will actually influence a designer and a developer, so that would be good.